Chance we will get out early, but I say that a lot, and it's really just empty words. So Judges chapter 6, so we want to finish Judges 6, and originally I thought we could look at each judge in 1 week, and now I realize just how foolish that idea was. So this is like our third week of Gideon. The two most well-known stories of Gideon are put right next to each other. And so we are hoping to look at both of them today. That says 6:28. We're actually going to start 6:36. That's kind of a typo because we looked at all of that last week. So no need to repeat everything. So 6:36 is the story of the fleece, and then chapter 7 is the story of shrinking the army down the size. So basically what we have here, there's this, it's going to be somewhat schizophrenic, is we're going to look at two different subjects. And remember that the story of Gideon is it's odd the way it's organized, is that Gideon is a man of faith who's full of doubt. He's kind of frustrated. We want to read our Bible characters. Maybe they start out with doubt like Moses, but then they're just strong faith. Gideon is a guy who he never has the strong faith. He's just always struggling. And so what we have here is the story goes back and forth between he's going to line up to go to war, and then he has his doubts. And he lines up to go to war, and God freaks him out. And he's going to line up to go to war, and it's a back and forth sort of story. So let's start here, chapter 6, verse 36. Then Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, behold, I am laying a fleece of wool out on the threshing floor. If there is dew and fleece alone, and it is dry and all on the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said." And it was so. And when he rose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece, he wrung enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl with water. Then Gideon said to God, "Let not your anger burn against me. Let me speak it just once more. Please let me test just one more with the fleece. Please let it be dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground let there be dew." And God did so that night, and it was dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground there was dew. This is the famous story of Gideon's fleece, probably the most famous story about Gideon. I remember growing up hearing the stories, and it was preached in Sunday school. When you think of Gideon, who's one of the more popular judges, it's him and Samson who are most popular. This is the story that sticks out. Samson wrestling lions and knocking down temples. Gideon is the little cowardly lion laying out of the fleece. Now, we said this last week, Gideon is a man of many contradictions. He's courageous and cowardly. He is a great leader who still lives with his father. Remember that. He is a man of faith and a man of doubt. And this is why actually I've really enjoyed Gideon, is because those contradictions are the norm. I find one of the areas believers struggle with is they think the contradictions are abnormal. Virtually every person you will meet in the faith, they're a Gideon. At times they are a great faith, and at times they are full of doubt. At times they're strong, at times they're weak. This is the norm. This is the norm. And that's why we should love the Bible, is our heroes are normal. And if we were in Gideon's shoes, we would have been just the same as he. He is no better, no worse than we are. And remember what we said in comparison to Samson. Gideon is a weak man made strong, whereas Samson is a strong man who ends up being weak. So it's a good thing the way that the story is told. Well, in prior to this, we get Gideon is called, and then the first thing he has to do is to destroy his own father's altars to Baal and Ashtaroth. And that gets him in trouble. But that is his first act of courage. Now, he does it cowardly. Remember, he does it in the middle of the night, and then he gets found out. And so his father comes batting for him. So he has to build an altar to the Lord. He has to destroy the altars of Baal and Ashtaroth. And that is on a small scale what he's going to be asked to do on a massive scale throughout all of Israel. But then the narrative is interrupted. So we get that on the small scale, Gideon and the altars. And then verse 33, the Midianites and Amalekites and the people of the east came together. They crossed the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. So you can see that they're ready to go to war. They're lining up. And we have got very few details about Gideon's army. We know that he has his clan. He's got people from his tribe, and he's got other tribes who are going to come to his aid. But we don't know how large the enemy's army is yet. We don't know how large or small Gideon's army is going to be, because the story keeps interrupting itself. And here's one of them. So we have, okay, Gideon's going to line up on this end, and the Midianites and Amalekites are going to line up on that end, and we're ready for the scene of fighting. And what do we get? Gideon says, time out, okay? 30 seconds, okay? We need a break, and we get the story about the fleece. So every time it builds up tension that something fun's going to happen, we get reminded Gideon is a little weakling. He's the cowardly lion. And this is the famous story of the fleece. Now, he makes two requests here. The first is he wants a wet fleece on dry ground, verses 36 to 38. And then the second request is he wants a dry fleece on wet ground, verses 39 and 40. And so he's going to ask the Lord to prove his own faithfulness on two occasions. Now, just pause and think about that. This is what makes the story so famous, but also so controversial. And as we'll see, that what do you do with this? Because if you're not careful, I think you can pull out some really dangerous conclusions. Think about it. Does God want you and I to do this? What if tonight you pray, hey God, we're under a flood warning. We're under a flood warning. Okay, I'm going to take my suede suit from the 1970s. I'm going to lay it outside, but I want it to be dry. And if it's dry, then I know you're calling me in the ministry, or whatever it is, you know. Is that how we do these things, you know? Because if you're reading it, you're thinking, that's what God wants us to do, to always test him. So what do we do with this? Okay, a couple of things. First of all, there is a historical context. I got to grab this. The historical context of the story is important. The challenge of the scene is, do we justify Gideon's actions? Is he doing the right thing? Is he doing the wrong thing? It's possible he's doing the right thing and God is honoring it. It is possible that he's doing something you're not supposed to do, but God is patient with him. Both options are offered here. It does seem like he is testing God, which the Bible condemns. Let me give you just two references here. Fleecing Jesus is what I'm calling this. Deuteronomy 6, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test as you did at Massa, Meribah. This is a story that Moses is referencing back in Exodus. Same thing in Exodus 17. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. Moses said to them, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? Notice here, by quarreling with Moses, they were testing the Lord. And he called the name of the place Massa, or Meribah, because the quarreling of the place of Israel, and because they tested the Lord by saying, is the Lord among us or not? Notice here, the assumption is God isn't faithful to his people. Let's test to see if he is faithful to us. I just pause there, and that may sound strange to us. How would you like it if your spouse did that to you? This is one of the things I have found with foolish people and foolish couples. If there isn't the trust of faithfulness, you start playing these silly games. And they are silly. So you may ask a question expecting a certain answer in response. But when they give you an honest answer, you're frustrated because you didn't want honesty, you wanted the right question, right? It's a test, you know. We do these silly things all the time. We also try to punish each other thinking that'll fix it, but that's another issue. So on the one end, people argue that, I think this is Tim Keller's point, that Gideon isn't testing God, he is exploring the nature of God. So Keller's argument is, Gideon is pretty ignorant of Yahweh. He has grown up in a more pagan culture, though he's Israelite. So probably what he has is, okay, we are the people of Yahweh, so they have a general worship of Yahweh, but really they're worshiping the Canaanite gods. So there's the cultural Judaism, and then there's the practical Canaanitism, if you will. This is, I'd probably be like Richard Dawkins coming out recently, saying, I'm a cultural Christian. The guy has made it his life to ruin Christianity in England, in the West. And he just comes out and says, I'm a cultural Christian. I'm like, okay, whatever, dude. What he's concerned is there's no more Christmas trees, but there's mosques everywhere in London all of a sudden. And he's starting to panic. We kind of warned you of that. But anyways, that's neither here nor there. So Canaanite gods by nature, Canaanite gods were gods of nature. So rain, fertility, wind, all that sort of stuff. And so Keller argues that what he's doing is he's showing that God is actually Lord over those things. It's not Baal who is, it's actually Yahweh. So in this context, Gideon is wanting assurance that Yahweh is the sort of God who can control the rain, the wind, the weather, and therefore can control armies. Maybe that's the case. I don't know. Furthermore, we need to note here that the purpose of this narrative is to be descriptive, not prescriptive. Where we get in trouble with the Bible is where we think everything in a narrative is to be mimicked. Sometimes there's details in a narrative that are just details. And we can think of silly examples. I don't think you should call down she-bears to maul a bunch of teenagers. Just a silly example. But when drawing a conclusion from a narrative, we do have to ask ourselves, are we being described something or are we being prescribed something? And this may be a good example of this. The narrator wants us to marvel at Gideon's cowardice and God's patience. If we miss that point of the story, we've missed the point of the story. Because over and over again, the narrator gets interrupted with his cowardice. So if we come to this and say, see, God wants me to constantly question his faithfulness. No, what we need to see is that even when God calls the weak, he is patient with them. Like me and you, God is patient with us. And we do foolish things because at the end of the day, we are uncertain God is going to be faithful. Much like when Moses struck the rock the second time. Or much like when Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham. There's all these stories of where people, in those moments of doubt, they do things that are foolish and God is still patient with them. He still fulfills his calling. So we make an error when we think that since it worked for him, it should work for me. I don't think that's the way we should read it. Thirdly, putting out your fleas, this is where that phrase comes from, is not a biblical method for determining God's will. I'm willing to bet, I didn't bother to do this, I bet that if you were to Google sermons on this passage, it'll have the phrase putting out your fleece or something like that in it. But I'm willing to bet at some point they're going to touch on this issue, that this is a story really about determining God's will. Now, there's some truth to that. But what we can say is this does remind us that when it comes to knowing God's will, oftentimes we overcomplicate it. And what we want is signs in heaven that make it very clear to us. In fact, I find one of the more practical issues is how do we determine God's will? And I do find that although sometimes it can be difficult to know what decision to make, we're looking for something we don't need to look for. Like, I get it. You wish you woke up every morning and God sent you an email. That would be nice. You wish you saw Post-it notes on the trees on your way out to the car. Or if there was clouds that said, you should marry that dude, or whatever it is. Like, we all want that. But nowhere in the Bible does it really tell us that's the way it works. Let me help you real quick with the will of God. Actually, I failed to mention this Sunday morning in Romans 12, 1-2, is Paul mentions that if you present your bodies and you present your minds, you'll be able to discern the will of God. That's how it concludes, and I failed to mention that Sunday morning. So how do you cipher God's will? Well, the Bible tells us, God's will for you is that you would be holy, and you would live for his glory. That's it. That's it. Okay? Now, I know what you're wanting to know is, should I quit my current job and take the risk of starting this business? Should I marry this dude or should I go out on that first date with him, or whatever it is? Like, we want these things, and that's what grips us. But we need to pause and say, why are we wanting answers to this when the Bible's clear what it is that God wants from us? His will is our sanctification. That's from 1 Thessalonians. God's will for your life is your sanctification. You will conform to the image of the Son. The Bible is very clear on this. And what you'll find is when we make that the priority, to use Romans 12 language, that we present our bodies as holy and our minds as transformed, renewed by the Spirit. When we make that a priority, the other things, it's not that they will be clear, but that we will be able and capable of making a decision. So there's a helpful book if you are interested in this. MacArthur has a good book called Found God's Will. It's a good little book, skinny thing. But my favorite book on this is by Kevin DeYoung called Just Do Something. It's a book about discerning God's will. And I actually think that's a helpful approach to it. The basic argument is more complicated than this. His basic argument is that if you are pursuing the glory of God in your life, growing in sanctification, make a decision. Think about it. I was actually talking to someone about this yesterday, trying to decide, should I take this job over here? It's really risky, but I feel like God's calling me to go over here. So, okay. Do you love your wife in the way that will give honor to God? Okay. Do you believe that no matter where you are, what you do, and where you find yourself, you are called to model Christ-like love toward your neighbors? Okay. And you just go down a list of basic Christianity. Are you committed to the local church that you would grow in fellowship, contributing and learning from others? Okay. You just keep going down the list and say, okay, make a decision. Make a decision. Because think about it. If you stay in the job you have, you're still doing the will of God. And God is in completely sovereign control over that. If you go take the other job, you're going to be doing the same thing. That doesn't mean that both are going to work out the way you want them to. But God is more concerned with your spiritual well-being than your financial well-being. I know Joel Osteen told you otherwise, but that's the case. Or when I was in college, every year we had to do a thing called Man to Man with Moeller. And it was required, all the men, it was basically telling us to get off pornography. But one of the things he talked about was discerning God's will for relationships. He said that he had one of the students come up to him and said, Dr. Moeller, I want to know, is it God's will for me to marry this girl? Moeller says, okay, is she real? Okay, let's start there. Yes, she's real. All right, that's 90% of the guys who ask me this question. Okay, so, all right, she's real. Is she a Christian? Yeah. Have you met the family? Yeah. You get along pretty good? Yeah. Have you dated for a while? Yeah. Basic questions you would ask anyone. And he goes, so what do you want from me? Well, I want to know, should I marry this girl? Does God want me to marry her? Like, what are you looking for? Does she like you? That's 95% of it, Hoss, I hate to tell you. Like if she's willing to marry you, don't ruin this. That's hard to come by. But what he was looking for was some lightning bolt. But if you pursue God's word, God's way, and God's wisdom, then God's will isn't about some secret insight knowledge. Just do it. Just go do it. Do the desires of your heart because your heart has been reformed by the gospel of Jesus. Isn't that liberating? That's just so liberating. Just go. If you want to go, go. If you don't want to go, don't. But just don't be gripped by this confusion that we have. Gideon's the opposite. He's laying out the fleece. But if he had developed a relationship with Yahweh, he wouldn't be in this sort of situation. Let me just add this little footnote here. We do something similar with grief. I'm willing to bet your family has something. A loved one passes that is just tearing the family apart. We all do this. Is we wish to have that one, this another conversation with them. We want that so bad, don't we? And we want the assurance that they're with us, whatever that may mean. Okay. So maybe you go to their gravesite and you talk. I'm not against that. Or maybe I remember when I was a teenager, one of our students died, and a bunch of her friends went to watch her favorite movie. And so that movie became the thing. They felt comfort because of that movie, because it reminded them of their friend. Maybe it's an animal, that someone had a certain animal they love, and every time you see that animal, you think of that loved one. And I'm not sure that's a healthy way of doing it, to do grief. But anyways, we got to move on. Last thing about this text. The main point is what God wills, God achieves, and there is nothing for us to worry about. So it should be good news for us that God uses weak men like Gideon. That's the theme, really, of the book of Judges, but particularly of Gideon. Think about it. Here, what is the difference between cowardly Gideon and anxious Peter? Not really much of a difference, and yet God uses them. So I don't think you should lay out your fleece. But if we find ourselves so cowardly like Gideon, good news, God still uses us. That's good news. Well, let's switch over here to chapter 7, where we see less is more. Chapter 7, we'll do the first 8 verses. we'll take them in sections. Verse 1, then Jerubbaal, that's Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was north of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. The Lord said to Gideon, the people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. Now therefore proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home, hurry away from Mount Gilead. Then 22,000 of the people returned, 10,000 remained. So now he's down to 10,000. The Lord said to Gideon, verse 4, the people are still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. And anyone of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, shall go with you. And anyone of whom I say to you, this one shall not go with you, shall not go. So he brought the people down to the water. And the Lord said to Gideon, every one who laps the water with his tongue, as a dog laps, you shall set by himself. Likewise, everyone who kneels down to drink. And the number of those who lapped, putting their hands to their mouths, was 300 men, but all the rest of the people knelt down and drank water. And the Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men who lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites to your hand. Let all the others go, every man to his home. So the people took provisions in their hands and their trumpets, and he sent all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, but retained the 300 men. And the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. So now we're getting back to the war. This is the part we want to read. But the story is still going so slow. So slow. So he puts out the fleece. He says, okay, God, are you going to give me victory? And God says twice, you're going to win. Don't worry about it. But then what does God do is he flips the script on Gideon. Gideon wants assurance. Because Gideon's looking at his numbers, and he's looking at the numbers of the Midianites and Amalekites. And he is vastly outnumbered. Tens of thousands more of them than there is him. He cannot win this. Now, if you know history, you know that history is full of these stories where the smaller army beat the bigger army. The three that came to mind, the one that really came to mind was the Greek battle at Thermopylae, where you have the Spartans against the Persians. And, of course, that's 300 men. The movie, kind of went kind of crazy on some things. But what you have are 300 highly trained Spartans. Spartans love war. That's all they did their life was prepare for war. And so they were able to push back the Persians, at least for a time. But a lot of that was based off of strategy. The Persians could have 1 million men, but you can't send 1 million men through that little gap there. So really it played into the hands of the Greeks. The English battle of Hastings, the Marines at Iwo Jima. I think Alexander the Great had a story like this, where he split his army, and he ended up splitting. Was he fighting the Persians? I don't know. And then the Persians thought they're splitting, and then at one moment he actually took his men right in the middle of the Persian that split. And so instead of going head on head, Alexander found a way right in the middle, and I think he had a group come from behind. So he was able to do that. We love these stories. We love the stories where the little guy beats the big guys, David and Goliath. However, if you're the guy in charge of the fight, you don't want this. So it's good writing, right? You have Gideon finally gets assurance from God. God's going to give you victory. And then God says, but I don't want you to sleep comfortably tonight. So let me see how complicated I can make this situation. This is similar to the story of Elijah at Mount Carmel, isn't it? You remember that Elijah says, okay, let's call down fire from heaven. You go first. And he says, look, I'm going to show you that my God's so powerful, I can make it more difficult on myself. Let me just drench mine and watch what happens. But Elijah was kind of cocky. God uses cocky people too every once in a while. But here, Gideon's the opposite. This is the last thing he needs. He's thinking, okay, if I have 32,000, I can't win, but God says he's going to give me a victory. Now he's going to lose over 90% of his army. Well, so the armies are beginning to battle there in verse 1. Notice they meet at the spring of Harod, verse 1. The Hebrew word for Harod means trembling, the spring of trembling. Well, that becomes the theme of this story, is that everything that happens adds to Gideon's trembling, his anxiety. And you just wonder if God's just toying with him at this point. So they're at 32,000 here by verse 1. And right before they go to battle, God says, you know what, you're missing something. And what you're missing is you need a smaller army. Smaller army? We already have a small army. What are you talking about here? So God says, what I need you to do is you need to send some of these people home. And so what he does in verse 2 is say, those who are scared, go home. Now, I am not an expert on military life. I've never been in the military. I'm not a military historian or war historian, anything like that. But I suspect most battles in history, most of the guys are scared to death. Right? Now, that's one of the reasons why the presence of the king, or whoever the hero is so important. I mean, every good war movie plays on this. You have the crazy people, like the Irishman in Braveheart, right? You got the crazy people who just love fighting. Captain America, right? You got those. But most of the guys, they're fighting to protect their family, you know. And so if you were to ask them, are you scared? The answer is yes. Yes. And so, of course, the majority of them go. So we would expect God to say, you need more, but now he says you need less. So those who, any soldier, fearful and trembling, he says there in verse 3, they are to return home. This shrinks the army from over 32,000 to 10,000. That is a 66% drop. Now, how would you like it if the President of the United States is going to go to war, and he says, you know what, I think we got too many troops. In fact, how about this, conservatives? The President of the United States cuts the Pentagon's budget by 66%. How long is he going to stay president? For one, the Pentagon ain't going to like that. But he would be called un-American and all this sort of stuff. And here comes Gideon saying, but you don't understand. This God that we haven't worshipped for a generation, it's what he told me to do. But what assurance do we have, Gideon? My fleece was dry last night. That's how I know, you know? So you can see the anxiety is just going to go through the roof. So then that leads to a second stage of shrinking the army. And this has to do with drinking water. And there's two camps. There's those who, because you don't have water bottles or anything like that, no water fountains, no tall glasses of ice-cold Coca-Cola. So those who stoop down to the water to drink like a dog, or those who kneel down to cup the water and drink it. That only 300 of them kneeled down, whereas the rest, they had you have to put your sword down, all that sort of stuff, in order to lap it up. So the 300 stay. This means the army he started with, he sent to call out all the tribes, his clan, all this, and he assembles them, and he's like, yeah, we're going to go fight. God's going to deliver us. And now, overnight, he's down to 1% of that. 1%. You almost imagine like his clan alone is what's left. I mean, just was 1%. 1%. But isn't this what we love about sports? If it's a college, like NCAA, be honest, so long as it's not your team losing, you love to see Duke, North Carolina, those sort of teams, Kansas. You love to see them losing to Robert Morris, St. Peter's, because those teams wouldn't beat, a team like a Kentucky. But we love that. Here's a team with little money, little resources. They don't have the recruits. We love that. But when it's real life in this is a terrible planning. And so there in verse 8, he says, okay, I've got my 300. Let's go to war. And they are given all the provisions of the remaining 10,000. Everyone else goes home. Can you imagine being among the men of the final 10,000? They show up home and their wives and kids are like, well, that was short. He goes, well, here's the thing. We whittled it down to 10,000, and I was among them, and I drink water funny, apparently. And so he sent me home. He sent you home for drinking funny? Yeah, I'm not making that up. I drank water the wrong way, and I was disqualified. I was dishonorably discharged from the Jewish military. I mean, it's a strange story. It's a strange story. So what do we do with this? Okay, one of the things that a lot of people come is they ask, why did God do it this way? There is a traditional reading of this, and I bet if you've heard a sermon on this, you've heard something like this. The first group was eliminated because fear is contagious. You would rather have a smaller army of brave men than a larger army mixed. So this is where Driscoll went, Don. He just went all about, you got to be a man and, all this sort of stuff. And part of the reason is because those who are afraid are more likely to retreat, thus endangering the rest of the army. The second group was eliminated because they put themselves in harm's way. Again, this is the traditional reading. So the idea is if you lap up the water, you have to stoop all the way down, take your weapons off, your shield, your sword, and all that sort of stuff, and to put yourself in a vulnerable position. But if you stoop down to cup the water, you can be close to your weapons, and you can look around you. Right? I remember as a kid doing Gideon. I couldn't tell you anything else in the sermon, but I remember this part of the sermon, because this is the traditional reading that you'll see in commentaries and everything else. However, this is me. I don't think that quite works out. There's a couple of reasons for this. One, that's not what the text says. The text never says God eliminated these thousands of men because they drank water the wrong way. It was just a way of separating. It's just to create two groups. It could have been a host of things. He could have kept the 300 men who just tucked the front of his shirt. Remember I made that joke Sunday morning. Those who shopped at Abercrombie & Fitch. You 300 stay. The rest of you, I don't want you to die. Okay? It could have been something like that. But the text never says that's why God did what he did. In fact, when it comes to drinking the water, when the battle happens, how you drink water doesn't matter. Who cares about that detail? You're going to war. You're not having a water drinking competition. Okay, here's a gallon of water. You bad guy, there's a gallon of water. Let's see who gets to the bottom first. It's not that kind of fight. It's a fight involving arrows, slings, swords, shields, and spears. So how you drink water doesn't really matter all that much. So I'm not sure that's the point of the text. However, the Bible has prepared us for a scene like this. In Deuteronomy chapter 20, we read this. Less is more is what I call it. When you go out to war against your enemies, all right, they're about to go out to war against their enemies, and see horses and chariots and an army larger than your own, you shall not be afraid of them. By the way, remember the story of Deborah involved chariots. You remember that it rained, and so the chariots probably got stuck in the mud, and it was God mocking Baal because Baal was supposed to keep it from raining so the chariots can. Sorry? So when you see the horses and chariots, of course chariots are connected to Egypt, and here in Deuteronomy they're coming from Egypt. Do not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God is with you, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Now, pause there. Before God sent Gideon, he sent them a prophet. You remember what his message was? You have forgotten that God delivered you from Egypt. I'm going to show you that God is still the God who delivers his people. So verse 2, and when you draw near to the battle, the priest shall come forward and speak to the people, and shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, today you are drawing near for battle against your enemies. Let not your heart faint. Do not fear or panic or be dread of them. For the Lord your God is he who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies, to give you victory. Then the officers shall speak to the people, saying, Is there any man who has built a new house and not dedicated it? Let him go back to his house, lest he die in the battle, and another man dedicate it. If there is any man who has planted a vineyard and has not enjoyed its fruit, let him go back to his house, lest he die in battle, and another man enjoy its fruits. Is there any man who has betrothed a wife and has not taken her? Let him go back to his house, lest he die in battle, and another man take her. And the officers shall speak further to the people and say, Is there any man who is fearful and faint-hearted? Let him go back to his house, lest he make the heart of his fellows melt like his own. Does it sound similar to the story of Gideon? The reference to the trembling and fear is clearly connected to Gideon. But notice here, the point of the story is to say, the numbers, they don't have anything to do with it. None of this stuff matters. 1 plus God's majority. So Moses is saying, look, you go out to battle, they're your enemies. God's going to give you this land. Go take it. You guys here who just got married, you haven't started a family yet, go home. That's more important because God's going to take care of this. You planted a vineyard and you haven't been able to enjoy that, go home. That's more important because God's going to take care of this victory. You're scared to death? Go home. God's going to give you victory. It's as if God is reminding Gideon of what he has already said. The question is, will Gideon believe that God will indeed give him victory. The only explanation God gives as to why he shrinks the army is in verse 3. Now therefore proclaim, verse 2. The Lord said to Gideon, the people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. When an army of 300 beats an army of tens of thousands, they can't take the credits any more than a little boy with a small Lunchable can take credit for feeding hundreds and thousands of people. You can't do it. You have to conclude God gave us victory. Not Baal, not Ashtaroth, God. And this is the point of the story. Here is a judge of uncertain faith, and God is forcing him to confront his doubts, his anxieties, so that in the end of the story, as we'll see in future weeks, Gideon has to conclude, I was not talented enough to deliver the people of Israel. God did it. And that's the good news. You realize that the greatest evangelist this world has ever seen was a hick kid, farmer's son. He was led to Christ by a fire and brimstone hick Kentuckian named Mordecai Ham. It's amazing that God can take a nobody like Billy Graham out of nowhere and take them all around the world and change them. This is what God does. He takes nobodies, the weak, and he makes them strong. And that's what we are to see here. Okay. Gideon will deliver Israel with a small group. Samson will deliver Israel with one man. So Othniel will have a great army. Gideon will have a small army. Samson will have no army. God delivers all of them. So those are not the means of God. Those aren't the means of the end. Those are the means God uses for God's end. That's the main point. All right, Danny, we miss anything? Good stuff. All right, so they will soon go to war, maybe. But the story of Gideon ends in chapter 8, so we are getting there. Okay, we'll get out a little early. I think the youth went off to Dairy Queen, I think. So we'll have to go enjoy an ice cream or something. All right, well, how about we close out in prayer? Don Douglas, will you close us in prayer?